Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the sustainable menus for healthcare. My name is Linda Varango, and I'm the Senior Advisor at the Canadian Foundation for Green Healthcare. We are pleased to present this webinar with our sister organization, Synergie Santé Environnement in Quebec. And the work that was done on the sustainable menus was a project under the Nourish program. And we'll have our speakers tell you more about that as well. I'd like to really thank Beatrice and Annie for all the hard work they put into this document. It's a tremendous piece of work they did. I was honored to be on the advisory committee for that project and for the Nourish program. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Beatrice and Annie. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Beatrice. So today I will be presenting you the webinar in English. Annie presented the one in French. So she's here to say hi, but I will be doing the rest of the presentation. So on the Sustainable Menu Guide, I am the project trainer. So I go in food services and train them to make their food services more sustainable. I'm going to let Annie present herself while I start my presentation.
Hi, I'm Annie Marquez. I'm a food service manager at the Suisse Centre-Sud de l'île de Montréal in Montreal, Quebec. I was part of the Nourish program, and with their help, I've been able to create the guide to sustainable menu with a big team, and I'm really happy. I'm working with Beatrice now to put it in place in all Quebec. So she will be presenting our work we did together. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you, Annie. So first of all, why are we talking about sustainable food? So there's two main reasons. We're talking about for human health and for planetary health. So humans have a lot of diseases and a lot of concerns that they have to deal with on a daily basis, which is partially related to the unsustainability of the food system. For instance, we have cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cancer, malnutrition, infections, and finally food insecurity. We also have concerns that relate to the planet. So for instance, we use a lot of resources for agriculture and livestock production. We also overconsume seafood, for instance, but we also overconsume a lot of other food categories as well. We emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, which I will be talking about in a bit. And there's also a loss of biodiversity in all our plants and our animals. And finally, we have climate variability, temperature extremes, and disasters, which all negatively affect our food system. And thus, we see that our food system right now is not sustainable, and we need to work towards making it more sustainable. So what do the studies say? So scientific experts groups continuously publish reports that highlight the need for a sustainable food system. So we have climate changes, temperature extremes, and related disasters that are causing planet and human suffering, and will continue to cause suffering unless changes are made. So the National Center for Climate Restoration published a report in 2019 saying that the collapse of human civilization would be expected within 30 years due to global warming of more than 3 degrees. One of the authors of this report was a senior executive in the coal industry, and this report validates a previous study that was endorsed by more than 15,000 scientists globally. So we see that the impact of this report that it can have. Climate models also regularly underestimate even the most extreme scenarios. And if we look at percentages, 35% of the Earth's living area or 55% of the global population will suffer from fatal heat conditions 20 days per year, which is an extreme amount. Another topic often discussed is greenhouse gas emissions as related to climate change. So reports attribute 25% of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, from forestry, and other land uses. Half of this is mainly from livestock, and the other half is mainly from deforestation. So we see that there's a huge impact on this end. The fishing industry increased its emissions by 28% between the 90s and 2011, so about 20 years, without necessarily increasing its production. And this represents about 4% of total food emissions. And the OECD published also a report saying that by 2050, emissions from agriculture could be the world's main source of greenhouse gas emissions. So at the international level, although it varies per country, it's still a huge impact that it can have on the world. We also see that the sustainable food is part of other international efforts. So if we look at the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which are basically areas for countries that need maximum effort in order to achieve a more sustainable, a more healthy and collaborative future. If we look at these goals, out of 17, there's about 12 that can be directly related to food sustainability. And the ones here that have a black arrow are the ones that we can directly relate to our guide to sustainable menus. So we have the good health and well-being, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, and life on land. Next, so we've been talking about the unsustainability of our food system, but how do we make it more sustainable? What exactly is sustainable food? Sustainable food has 6 dimensions that are related to each other. So when we talk about health, we're talking about, for instance, adequacy of diets, nutrient sufficiency. Quality, we have the acceptability of food, its values, its attributes. In terms of social values, we have the respect of cultures, respect of identities, social cohesion. Environment, we're talking about renewable resources, respect of biodiversity. Governance, we can talk about transparency, coordination of all stakeholders in the food system. And finally, economy, so the cost to and of the food system, decent working conditions, so everything that's surrounding the economy. So all these dimensions are related to each other, and they work together as a whole to create a more sustainable food system. So now that you know the definition of sustainable food, how do we put it in practice? So what can we do with this in everyday life? So we defined the phrase sustainable menu practices as any practice that we can take to increase the sustainability of our actions. So for instance, we have the health dimension, where we're talking about choosing more vegetable protein, limiting ultra-processed food. While when we look at quality, we're looking at choosing fresh local foods that fit the season that we're in. We're looking at homemade recipes, fair trade practices, reducing waste. So a bunch of practices that are not limited only to this, that can be taken to really increase sustainability. And like I said, they're each related to each other. So for instance, if we're talking about a vegetarian diet, we're going to talk about the health dimension on one end, but also the environment dimension on the other end. So we have many instances in which we take into account many practices in our action. We also have Canada's Food Guide, where the Guide to Sustainable Menus was inspired in part by Canada's Food Guide that was released in 2019. And if we look at all the recommendations that the Food Guide has, yes, they're mostly based on health, but we also start seeing some environmental concerns in the Food Guide, which was not the same as the previous Food Guide in 2007. So for instance, we talk about choosing plant proteins more often, eating variety, so having a plate full of colors of fresh local foods, eating in moderation, so not over consuming foods, cooking less often, having less packaging, less ultra-processed foods, reducing waste as well. There is also a Canada's Food Guide that is specific to First Nations. So it's Eating Well with Canada's Food Guide, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So these populations of Canada we have the program Nourish that the guide was based on really spotlights the traditional indigenous diets because it reflects well what a sustainable diet is. So consuming local produce specific to the season, consuming food that is hunted, fished, or gathered with the utmost respect for nature, choosing doing everything homemade, using all parts of meats, for example. So it's all sustainable practices that makes traditional indigenous diets one of the first sustainable diets that we know. And finally, the last bit of theory I'm going to show is the Eat Lancet Commission, who came out for recommendations for basically a planetary diet that would fit the whole planet, basically. And for every continent, they came out with recommendations and to show us also where we are. So if we look at the image here, and there's the circle with the lines, the orange circle. In here is the boundary, the planetary and health boundaries that we should stay in to not so that it's not bad for our health and for our planet. And right now what we are consuming is over this this orange circle. And so basically they're telling us to reduce by certain amounts. So for example, reduce eggs by almost 300%, dairy products by almost 150%, etc. And they are telling us to increase vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, fish, basically to stay within our planetary and health boundaries. So basically that we have better for health, better for planet. I know it says network unstable, so I just want to make sure that everything has been going well. If you've been hearing everything.
Oui.
Perfect.
Yes, it's okay.
So I will start talking about the guide now. So we saw all the theory, and here is a screenshot of our website. So this is the guide to sustainable menus. So our goal is really to help food services change the food that they offer to their clientele so it can be increasingly more and more sustainable. So we aim first to help food service managers in the healthcare industry because that was really the goal of the guide. But we also want to help any food service manager in any institution, whether it be private, public, so it can be schools, for example, and the general public to make it really more accessible for people to get tips on how to make their menus more sustainable. So if we compare, for example, the website, which is a lot more user-friendly, the website is also has very succinct pages where it's very concise, while the PDF guide, for example, so that we can also find on the website, you can download the guide. This guide is really more geared towards food service managers, where you have in detail how you can change your food services. So the introduction, here we have the first 3 chapters of the guide. So it's how to use the guide, the steps to create a sustainable menu, all the tools you would need, all the equipment you would need to use the guide, for instance. So this is where you would find all the information in the introduction section. And then each chapter has its own color. So when you click on a chapter, you're able to find all the information related to that chapter. So for here, each chapter has recommendations, so general recommendations to increase sustainability, but a lot of them repeat themselves throughout the guide. And so we thought it would be interesting to put all these recommendations together because they do reference almost every chapter in the guide. So there's 7 recommendations. I don't know why here there's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So It's 7. So first of all, favor variety. So in every single type of food that we eat, we want to favor variety. So whether eat different kinds of fruits and vegetables, eat different kinds of protein. So we have a bunch of variety that we can have that we should offer to our clientele. The second recommendation is to increase the consumption of vegetable proteins, fruits and vegetables, and purchase seasonal and local foods. So there's also the idea of really seasonal and local being working well together to be the most sustainable possible. Limiting consumption of animal protein, that goes a little bit with the second recommendation. So choosing eggs and poultry more often compared to the other sources of animal protein, and particularly avoiding processed meats. Next, purchase foods from sustainable production. So that goes for every type of food. So whether we're talking about fishing, so choosing sustainable fishing, other products that we can get fair trade products, for example, coffee, local agriculture. So when we're talking about local fruits and vegetables, for instance, we're talking about sustainable production. Then purchase fresh food or least processed food. So that goes for any kinds of food. Try to make it more homemade, more fresh, rather than buying ultra processed. Purchase foods without packaging or least packaged foods. So the least amount of packages, again, goes a bit with the one right before. So the least amount of processed foods, you're going to have necessarily less packaged. And finally, eat less and with moderation. So avoid overconsumption, avoid waste. So also looking at ways to prevent waste. That way it's a change that you do in your food service to prevent waste without necessarily having to make changes in your menu in the first place. Use leftovers and practice composting, recycling as well. That is not always practiced in food services. All right, so we're going to start with the protein chapter. The protein chapter is the biggest chapter of the guide because we talk about a lot of different proteins. Here we have a list of foods that are ordered from the most sustainable choice to the least sustainable choice. So it's important to understand that there's not the least sustainable choice. So let's say number 12, the red meats. We didn't put a red stop sign saying no meats, remove that from your menu. The idea is to really favor variety within this list, and that the most sustainable choice would be higher, while the less sustainable choice would be lower on the list. It's also important to understand that this list is not static, it's very dynamic. So it changes with time, with practices. So for example, if we find ways to produce certain types of proteins that is more sustainable, well, this might change the order of the list. For instance, if we all start eating fish 4 times a week, then it would most likely fall at the end of the list, so after red meats, just because it would be less sustainable for us to consume that amount of fish. For wild game meats, for example, so wild game meats is number 5 on the list. So it's the first on this list, it's the first meat we see. So number 1 to 4 is vegetable protein. Sorry about that. So as we talked about, the traditional indigenous diets are the ones that were the first most sustainable diets. And so it's based partly on this that we put it on this list. The fact that the indigenous diets, we consume the whole meat, for instance. We also share with the community. So if we don't eat a part of the meat, we're going to give to others so that they can consume it. They can use the meat as well. So it's higher on this list. But then again, in food services, looking at the outlook, it's not necessarily possible for every food service to gain access to wild game meats or to serve it to clientele. But it's still on this list because of its linked to indigenous diets. And also the last thing I wanted to mention with a list like this, so I said it's dynamic, the positions can change from one to another. But if you look at one number, it can also change within that number. And so if we're looking at, let's say, dairy products, well, not all dairy products are equal, so they wouldn't necessarily all be on a number 9 of the list. They would maybe change depending on the product we're talking about. So every number has variations in that sense. So here is just a graph to show you the greenhouse gas emissions across the supply chain. So it's not a surprise that on the top of the graph we see beef as in emitting the most greenhouse gas. And then if we look at the complete bottom of the graph, we see nuts. So nuts is a little bit controversial in the sense that we need a lot of water to produce nuts, but the amount of land that it uses, that it needs really to be produced, makes it a little bit better compared to other foods in the food supply chain. But then again, you also have to be careful. So if a population produces nuts, and they're using a monoculture, so they're only producing nuts, and they're reducing the amount of water that's available for their human population, well, then it's probably not the best either. So we see that in the protein chapter and basically in all foods, there's always some differences, and you always have to think about every aspect of the food chain, of the food system. And so in the guide we try to make it as clear as possible, so what to choose more often, what to choose less often, for instance. So hopefully that's it's easy for you to understand how we put it in the guide. Here we wanted to give examples. So these are direct examples that Annie used in her food services. So I'm going to explain a little bit of each. So if ever I'm wrong, Annie, just stop me. So first of all, we have the garden chili. So the garden chili that is not made with meat, it is made with textured vegetable protein, or TVP. And so it's all about the spices. So adding as much spices that resemble the regular chili, meat chili, makes it more acceptable for clientele to eat it, because it does taste the same as the meat chili. And then in the middle, we have the pasta with Alfredo sauce. So the Alfredo sauce is, instead of being made with a large amount of cheese, we reduce the amount of cheese, and it's made with white beans, like a white bean puree with some sun-dried tomatoes. So the beans are, we can say, hidden in the sauce. So it works really well for long-term care centers, for instance, where they wouldn't necessarily eat the beans unless it was kind of hidden in the sauce. So we increase the amount of protein in this dish and the amount of fiber just by replacing the sauce with white bean puree. Next, we have the tourtière, which is completely vegetarian. So it's made with tofu, mushrooms, and green lentils that are blended together. And it recreates the same color and texture as a regular meat tourtière. And it also has the same idea as having the same spices as a regular tourtière, so that it tastes the same as well. And it's very hard to see the difference. And then on the bottom left, we have the meatloaf. So a meatloaf that is a mix of ground pork and TVP. So again, a textured vegetable protein. The idea is not necessarily to make every meal vegetarian, but also to just reduce the amount of meat that we consume. So by replacing part of the ground pork with TVP, we keep the same amount of protein, we increase the amount of fiber, but we also keep the same taste because we still have ground pork in the recipe. Same thing for the tomato meat sauce. It's beef with 25% tofu. Then again, we're reducing the amount of meat, increasing the amount of vegetable protein with the same taste as the regular meat sauce. And finally, there's the vegetarian pizza that I believe is chili made with a TVP. So apparently people think that it's meat because the spices that are used, everything that's used is very, very similar to what's used on a meat pizza. All right. Next, we just wanted to say a little something on fish. So this is more particularly for Quebec. So in Quebec, we have 12 indigenous species of fish. However, out of these 12, we only consume about 2 or 3. So it's important to discover what we have that's available for us. So reducing the amount of fish that are less good for the environment. So for instance, Annie, this morning she was giving an example that in her menu, she removed the tilapia and Pegasus from her menu. So these are 2 fish that are particularly non-sustainable. So ideally replacing with other types of fish, which is not always easy. Yeah, reducing in part are particularly bad for the sustainability would be a good idea. So that closes on the protein chapter. And now we have the starches chapter. So again, same idea with a list of more sustainable to least sustainable. Here, what would be important to discuss is, for instance, the rice. So why is the rice in last position? So there's health concerns, particularly because of the amount of arsenic that is found in rice. In white rice, it's not as bad because we remove the outer layer of the grain, so most of the arsenic is removed in white rice. So we're talking more about, let's say, brown rice that still has some arsenic inside. It's also not local, so it's a little bit lower on the list. So often in terms of starches, we eat rice, we eat pasta, and we eat potatoes. It's the 3 most consumed starches in our diets, which gives a lot of pressure to monocultures. So we should focus on other types of starches to eat more variety. So just in terms of root vegetables, there's a lot more than just potatoes that we can eat. And then we also have all the other ones that are on the list here. So the second one on the list, for example, ancient grains. So we have millet, spelt, frike. So these are all naturally grown grains that we can add to our menus. A little note here on quinoa. So quinoa, we see it's a little bit further down the list compared to the other grains. Basically, quinoa, the idea is that there's a huge pressure from the monoculture. So in the countries that do produce quinoa, they started producing so much for export that the population doesn't have any more for themselves, and prices skyrocketed because it was coined as like a superfood for the industry. And so populations that live in those countries can't necessarily afford the price of quinoa anymore. So these populations have a lesser quality diet than before. So that's why we put it a little bit lower on the list. So like I said, rediscover ancient grains, put more variety in your menus. So we can make pilafs with almost every type of grain. You can make a spelt pilaf, a barley pilaf, for example. Some puddings as well is very easy to make with certain types of grains. And in Canada, we have the wild rice, which is the only cereal that's indigenous to Canada. It's rich in protein, it's rich in fiber. So we should rediscover it. We should add it to our menus. But what we can do is add it a bit like the meat, so add it partly in our menus. So do a mix of half white rice, half wild rice to maybe get the acceptability part of this dish on the menu. Replace, for instance, Annie was also giving the example that on her menu they have a mix of 7 grains, which includes rice. So we have a mix of a bunch of different grains where you have that variety, where you have that sustainability, but you also have the acceptability part of it. Next, for the vegetable chapter, so there's a bunch of calendars. So whichever province you're in, there's a different calendar for fruits and vegetables that you can have. And so here is one that's based off Quebec, which is sometimes a little bit different. We have in the guide ways to increase the variety of vegetables, the colors in a plate, to increase local and seasonal produce as well. There's also a lot of initiatives that are starting, so different organizations. So in Quebec, for instance, we have Équiterre that help food services get more local produce in their menus. And because it is something that's difficult to reach out to farmers, for instance, and to get more fruits and vegetables that are really fresh and in season. And so there's a lot of programs that are starting to come out and that have already come out to really help these food services. Next, we have the soup chapter. So this chapter explains all different types of soups, broths, for example. So a large part of it is really reusing, so recycling leftovers, so side dishes, for instance, while reusing them in a soup, making your own broths, so limiting the use of powdered broths that you purchase, but making them yourself. So a bunch of different types of broth we can make. Here we found it was interesting to put a recipe from the Whitehorse General Hospital in Yukon, who gave us the recipe, which is on the website that you can find. And it's a bone broth that they make homemade and that they use in their recipes. So this is an idea that was very inspiring for all food services to do broths like this. And when we talk about there's also a need to talk about the traditional Indigenous Three Sister soup. So this is based on the Three Sister Garden, which are basically three crops that are inseparable. So it's inseparable sisters that rely on each other to grow and to thrive together. So we have squash, we have corn, and we have beans. So they have many advantages of growing together, and they each benefit each other. So for instance, the corn plant will serve as a post for the climbing beans, so that the beans will be able to climb this post, while the beans themselves, they will fix the nitrogen that is beneficial for corn growth. And then their combination in diets also allows us to consume all the essential amino acids. And then for the squash plant grows really big leaves, so large leaves that will cover the ground. So it's going to keep weeds from growing. It's going to keep the ground cool and hydrated. So they really each help each other in that way. And then there's a soup that is made with these three plants. So the Three Sister soup with corn, squash, and beans. So we also have a recipe for this in the guide, on the website, sorry. And then we go on desserts. So the dessert chapter here, the idea is really to stop using always the same ingredients to make recipes. We always use, for instance, white sugar, butter, and all-purpose flour, but we can do so much more with desserts. We can serve in-season regional fruit, and then we can also have other fruits that can be served, homemade mousses, homemade puddings, homemade baked goods, and then at the end of the list, we have ready-made processed desserts. So here is just a little mention to the fact that we have about 200 species of wild berries in Canada. And so rediscovering these berries, adding them to your menu, looking at when they are in season, and then looking at how you can replace them in some of your recipes. Same thing with all other ingredients. So for instance, if you want to reduce the amount of animal protein you have in one of your recipes, well, you can replace the eggs with something else. So you can replace the eggs with different kinds of seeds, like flax seeds, like chia seeds. Replacing fat, so you can replace fat with apple sauces if the apples are in season, with pumpkin puree if the pumpkins are in season. So there's a lot that can be done in terms of these replacements. Sugar, we have local maple syrup, we have local honey that we can use in recipes as well. And then in wheat, we can replace part of our all-purpose flour, for instance, with 1/3 buckwheat flour, and then use the other 2/3 as all-purpose. So we start replacing gradually the kind of flours that we use in our recipes. Here is the chapter on condiments, seasonings, sweeteners, and fats. So here we wanted to mention a point on salt. So the way salt is produced is not always sustainable, and there's some concerns for the bird population that flies over salt ponds. So there's also an idea to not only for the health of humans, so we do know that the overconsumption of salt is an issue, but also the environmental impacts that salt production can have. So replace with other condiments. So for instance, using nutritional yeast that can be done, or seaweed. So I'm not sure for the rest of Canada, but in Quebec, we have some seaweed that grows in Quebec, so in Gaspésie. And seaweed is rich in fiber, it's rich in protein, and vitamins and minerals, but it's also, it could be a good replacement for salt. So it would be a good idea to start adding this more to menus and replacing the salt with other alternatives. All right, so there's 5 other chapters that we haven't covered. Not 5, I'm sorry, but we haven't covered all the chapters, and we didn't even cover everything that was in each chapter. It was really just a little snapshot view of what there is in every chapter. So for sure, it would be a good idea for everybody to go look on the websites, to go and on the guide if that interests you, and see everything that we can offer as well. So in each chapter, we not only have all this information that I presented, but we also have different tools and tips to include more sustainable choices. So for instance, on this document, you see the bottom part that's in orange. It's all tips for inclusion in your recipes, so how to use them and how to make them so that the clientele will accept it maybe a little bit more, gradually increasing it in your menus. So do those that work for you and those that work for your food services as well. Here is an example of a menu analysis table for each chapter and each meal. So we have lunch, dinner, and we also have breakfast. So it's basically looking at what is my current menu. Do I want to increase legumes? Do I want to reduce dairy? Do I want to maintain eggs? So it's basically looking at what you want to do, what you want to increase, what you want to decrease, what you want to maintain, and looking at the current cost. And then if you make those changes, how will it affect my cost? And so, for instance, Annie was saying in her food services, they were able to add more plant protein. So replace some of the meat with some plant protein that do cost less, and then use that extra money that came from it costing less and buying Nordic shrimp, for instance. So the Nordic shrimp that are more expensive but are more sustainable. So you're able to spend a little more on this because you save money on buying tofu, for instance. So all of those tools you will find in the toolboxes. So each chapter has a toolbox, and you can find all the appendices with all these tools, tips, etc. And there's also a recipe section. So there's one document with all the recipes that we have, that we still are adding recipes to, some that are made for larger portions, and some that still need to be tested for larger portions. And if ever you want to add some to our list, feel free to email us and we're for sure going to add them. So as soon as they're tested, we add them to the list. And so we know that they do work, they are appreciated by clientele. And finally, a last little section on our collaborating partners. So we have a few collaborating partners that we keep adding, that we keep improving. And so, for instance, here in Quebec, we have Équiterre that we work with. And so there's a link on our website to tools and webinars that they came out with for all public and private institutions that wish to obtain more responsible and local foods in their food services. For now, I think the tools are only in French. However, as we go on, we're going to keep adding collaborating partners, and hopefully we have one area where everybody can really find tools for each partner and have really a community that works together. And so here is the link for the website. So the English version, you have the EN at the end. And then if ever you have questions, you want to send us recipes or you want recipes in another amount, you can always email us here on this email. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter to get the latest updates. And then you can download the guide. So here there's a button to download the whole guide, but you can also go in each chapter and only download a chapter, only download the recipes, only download the tools. So there's a bunch of possibilities for you to use the guide and the website. These are our references, so 250 references. We only put a little bit of these. So thank you very much. I'm just going to stop my screen share. Whoops.
There was one question in the chat box. It's can you explain why some species of fish are not sustainable? Beatrice, are you there? Oh, she left. Oui, attends. Okay, you're there? Ton micro. Just open your mic. There's a question. Can you explain why some species of fish are not sustainable? Ton micro. Ouvre ton micro.
You're muted.
So.
All right, can you hear me?
Oui, c'est bon, vas-y.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, my network connection is not always the best. So can you just repeat the question, please?
Can you explain why some species of fish are not sustainable?
Yes, so basically, it always depends where the fish is from. It also depends how much we are consuming. So is there an overconsumption of one type of fish, for example? So when we consume a lot of one type of fish, then it puts a lot of pressure on those populations. So that's why the idea is really to eat variety. There's also the idea of farmed fish versus wild fish. So the farmed fish that are usually less sustainable than the fish that are in the wild, that might have a little bit more nutritional value, that do have the free space and living in symbiosis with other creatures, for instance, in the oceans. So it really depends what kind of fish we are talking about, but there's a lot of factors that affect the unsustainability.
And there's websites also that we share in the guide that keeps us updated on which type of fish we should be eating, because it's always changing. So we could not put it directly in the guide, but we put the links to the sites.
Yeah, and the certifications too are always changing. So always make sure to check those certifications as well.
I'm curious if any seniors are giving you any pushback on the new menu.
Yeah.
Annie, I'll let you answer that.
So at first, when we introduced I'm going to put my camera, sorry. when we introduced our vegetarian food, yeah, it was not good. They didn't like it, they didn't want it, and they were really frustrated. You have to understand that we had the deadline to respect by our government to put new menus in place. So we didn't have the time to test all the recipes with them before putting them in place. But now it's been 3 years, and we've been just improving. And now we have the recipe that Beatrice showed you, like the examples, are really on our menu. It's working. And we have a process that when we create the food, we have to test it in long-term care. And if we don't have the good notes, it doesn't go on our menu, even if we like it.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have another question. What do you think about lab-grown meat, and could that be a real solution? And I think my question is kind of related to that. So, what your thoughts on plant-based proteins? You know, the Impossible Foods thing that's big, huge trend now. So, what do you think of that?
Annie, you can go, and I'll
Oui.
add on.
Right now, the meat produced in laboratory, the study we find, it's that it takes more energy to produce, because the labs we have to put in place, all the energy have to be put in the producing of this meat. So it takes like as much energy as eating the meat from and it doesn't give the same benefit to the herd when the meat is sustainably produced. So right now it's not produced in sufficient amount to make it more enough sustainable. And Beatrice,
And
I don't know if you had.
Yeah, and I think with anything, any type of new innovation like that too, it always takes a bit of time before it can be more sustainable, and maybe it will never be, it will never reach that point. But any innovation, it always takes a lot more resources, and then maybe at some point, maybe in 10 years, we'll have this conversation and it will be better. So it's also the time frame we need to wait.
And for the impossible meat, or this is made like with soya or with vegetarian protein, but it's always ultra processed. There's a lot of energy put into the processing of these type of food, and usually there's a lot of packaged also that comes with this type of ultra processed food. But it's in some cases it's better than meat or than eggs, or than that's why it's the fourth, I think, in our, because tofu is there, but if it's really ultra processed and there's a lot of packaging, it can go down. And there's a lot of salt also, and all type of additive in those kind of food.
Yeah, looks like we have a follow-up question to this answer. So Alberto asks, what if you use renewables for this process for the lab-grown meat?
I don't know of these studies, what exactly they are. I don't know if Annie, you would have more information on that. I think maybe she bugged.
Sorry, I lost my connection. I'm there. Okay, so it's just that, sorry. It's not just the energy, the type of energy that's used, it's all the facilities that has to be built. Like, to make a laboratory, to use I don't know how it's really done, but there's a lot of instruments, or I don't know how to call it, that has to be produced, like to realize those type of food.
That makes sense. Yeah, we have another question on the chat. So what types of tree nuts are available in Canada?
So I know in North America we have almonds, we have pecans, pistachios, I believe. There's a whole list in the guide, but off the top of my head, we have those. Yeah.
I have a question on the UN SDG goals. So I was just wondering, there are a bunch of them related to food. So is there would we kind of be prioritizing one over the other? If so, like how do we go about kind of, working on, like, do we work on any one first and then how we...
The thing with those goals is that they all kind of are linked together too. So it's hard to say, well, we're only going to work on this one, because by working on this one, well, necessarily you're probably going to be helping this one, and this one. So for sure, those goals, I feel like when we're doing something at a bit smaller scale, because obviously the goals are for the whole country, but if we're looking at something on smaller level like this, anything you do is kind of going to impact all of the goals that are related to food. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Okay.
I just want to be mindful here of the time. We have a couple of minutes left. If anybody else has any questions, please put them in the chat. Our experts will deal with those. Oh. Are you measuring any metrics related to achievement towards the UN SDGs?
No, we're not doing that ourselves. There's no way for us to measure them. No.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none, I will. Oh, Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So I'm just curious, like, how would we kind of potentially incentivize hospitals and organizations maybe to kind of move towards more sustainable menus, given like the potential higher costs? Like, typically when you have a organic food or like more not like processed like plant processed mass manufactured food, but like more organic natural sources, it tends to increase the costs. Right, so how would we kind of incentivize hospitals to move towards, or even organizations to kind of consider sustainable menus?
Well, there's two ways that you can save on cost. So let's say what Annie did, so saving on replacing some animal protein with plant protein. By doing that, some changes, you're able to save some money and then be able to implement other more expensive items. There's also the whole idea of food waste. So when you waste a lot of food, it's a lot of money that you're wasting as well. It's a lot of energy that you're putting in. And so when you're able to reduce your costs by reducing waste, then you can also use some of that money for those more expensive foods. And not every sustainable food is more expensive either. It really depends what you're looking at. I don't know.
Have you done any return food tray audits to see if people are eating, or maybe there's something that they aren't eating, so that you can adjust that menu?
Yeah, it's part of the process to make sure that our menu are accepted, and our employees always tells us this is all going to garbage. So in that way we do it, but and we have students also that helps us with this.
So I see no more questions. Our time is up here. So on behalf of the coalition, I'd like to thank our friends at SSE, Natalie, and thank you, Annie and Beatrice, for pulling together the guide to sustainable menus. Just reinforce that it is available as a download at menudurable.ca/e. And I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and thank you for your contribution to this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.